Welcome to Computers, Ethics, and Society. I'm Tom, and today we are talking about ethics of care. Ethics of care is another ethical paradigm or another ethical theory, and essentially what the ethics of care says is that the central kind of importance of ethics, the central focus of ethics is the care for particular people that we have social obligations to, right? So friends and family mostly. And that's kind of like the starting point for ethical evaluation. Now, put that way, ethics of care does not seem like that big or controversial of an idea, right? Yeah, of course I care for people around me, my parents and kids and whatnot. But it is a pretty substantial commitment. And we'll talk about that in just a second by looking at a particular ethical dilemma and how people like Kant and Mill approach it. One thing to mention at the outset is that ethics of care kind of controversially falls kind of under the heading in some sense of feminist ethics. It's controversial because there's no one unified view of feminist ethics, right? Lots of different views kind of get put under that heading. Anyone that is somewhat critical of traditional moral theory and thinks that gender is at all important to ethics kind of gets lumped into feminist ethics. But whether or not ethics of care is a feminist theory is not really something that's going to concern us too much. Let's think about an ethical dilemma. And this is one that will come back and we will talk about in much more depth when it comes to things like self-driving cars. But there is a kind of a famous ethical dilemma. It's a thought experiment first put forth like in the late 60s, early 70s. It's called the Trolley Problem. Now, some of you might be familiar with it. They kind of did a play on it on Good Place. But the trolley problem is this scenario where there's a trolley going down a track. And that trolley, the track that it's on has 4 people on it, okay? And those people can't see or hear the trolley. They're preoccupied for whatever reason. And if the trolley keeps going down that track, it's going to kill those 4 people, right? As it turns out, there's a switch track before those 4 people. And on that switch track is one person, okay? And that person also can't hear or see you or see the trolley. You are standing by the switch. So the ethical dilemma here is, what do? Do you throw the switch and have the trolley hit the one person, or not throw the switch and kind of allow the trolley to hit the 4 people? It's an issue about distributing harms, right? Neither situation is good, right? Someone's gonna die in that situation. But the question is, what do? Now, looking back at deontology, Kant's deontology, and Mill's consequentialism, they both have very clear answers for what you do. The consequentialist thinks you throw the switch, right? And then one person dies, but that saves 4. You weigh the pros and cons, that's much better outcome, right? The deontologist, on the other hand, thinks, no, you definitely don't throw the switch. If you throw the switch, for Kant, he thinks that, you're inserting your will there. And now you're really actively killing someone rather than kind of witnessing a tragic event, right? For Kant, it's never okay to kill someone, and it's not okay to use that person's life and sacrifice their life in order to save someone else's life, right? He thinks, that's a kind of manipulation, doesn't respect someone's autonomy and these kinds of things. So the reason why I bring this up is because, you might think, well, who's on the tracks, right? Like, what's the context for this going on? Think about if, the person on the one track, maybe you're very, you have a very consequentialist intuition, like, of course you throw the switch, right? And then you find out that the person on that track is, your sibling, right? Does that change your answer? Should that change your answer? What if, you're a Kantian, but the four people on the original track are children, right? And the one person on the other track is an elderly person, right? I mean, how do these change your intuitions? And they seem to change. I mean, a lot of us would say, killing a child is terrible, horrible, way worse than allowing, an adult to die. So our intuitions tend to like shift a lot when we kind of we fill in the kind of faces, right, with particular people, right? The reason why I bring this up is because for ethics of care, they're going to say, it matters who's on the tracks a lot, right? It matters who's in this situation, and having an ethical theory in general, like some motivation for why we should look at who's on the tracks, is because if you have an ethical theory that gives you a hard and fast answer without having any knowledge of or even any concern for who's on those tracks, you might think that that's a very inadequate moral theory, right? It's too abstract. It's too divorced from our actual, ethical reasoning, right? And something like this, it's not exactly how ethics of care like comes about, but something like this can motivate a position like ethics of care, where not only are you concerned with care for others, but care for particular people, right? The way in which we prioritize, our family and friends when we're making ethical decisions, right? And so ethics of care is what you might call a particularist moral theory, right? It thinks that you need to understand each situation in its particular context, and ethics of care kind of rejects the general strategy of something like consequentialism or deontology that has kind of a general universal rule of thumb, right? Or universal moral imperatives, right? They think actually you need to take things piecemeal, case by case, and you need to kind of prioritize those specific relationships you have, those relationships of care, right? Relationships of what they'll call dependency, right? So anyways, there are several features. There's not going to be a and all be all like universal moral principle for ethics of care. So it's going to be very different from consequentialism and deontology in this way. But there are several, kind of defining features that I talk about in my notes, and I'm going to go through those and then talk a little bit about how ethics of care might apply in some of the situations that we will look at in this course. As I mentioned, first feature is that it focuses on the care for others, particularly relationships of dependencies, right? And these are very prevalent in our lives, right? Kids are very dependent upon their parents, caretakers, the elderly, the sick, people who are mentally ill, and even people who are maybe sick or have some kind of injury for a period of time, right? We all have periods of dependency from time to time, and we're all in a place to kind of give care to someone in a relationship of dependency from time to time, right? So this is the focus of ethics of care. One thing to note is that Kant and Mill don't really reference these kinds of relationships at all. Right. So that's one thing to think about to understand why it's a substantial theoretical commitment to make this kind of prioritization. But also, our moral intuitions around relationships of dependency are pretty pronounced, right? So, if I, am at a party or something and someone else I run into, we get in a fight and I hit him, right? That's not good. I'm not being a good person. But if that person is 8 years old, right? Now I'm a really horrible person, right? It heightens our moral sensibility in a certain sense, right? We pass a lot more judgment on those kinds of actions, right? When it comes to someone who's a child, or if someone's dependent upon you, you're taking care of your elderly aunt, and then you start stealing money from her, right? Like you're really taking advantage of the situation. We tend to think that that's really bad, right? Maybe even worse than stealing from a store or something in kind of more public realm. So they definitely prioritize these relationships of dependency. The second feature of ethics of care is that it values emotion. Um, People like Kant in particular think that emotions really corrupt our ethical reasoning, right? So if you are doing something because it makes you feel happy, or something because you are angry, for Kant, that really kind of like edges in some sense of self-interest or selfishness. And also for Mill, we do, utilitarian kind of calculus, right? You just weigh the pros and cons about how much benefit or drawback an action has. And you're not really thinking about your own kind of gut feeling. But when it comes to ethics of care, they actually think that, your emotions, your feelings of sadness, your feelings of anger, your feelings of happiness, really facilitate your ethical reasoning. Right. And so, I see someone hurt someone I love and I get angry. And that is, one might think, and ethics of care thinks that's well placed, right? That's good motivation. You should not be happy about that, right? And that's going to facilitate your ethical judgment that what that person did was wrong. Okay. The third component here is that it rejects the abstraction to general moral theories. We've talked about this just a little bit briefly here. There are a number of reasons for doing this. One is that, um, uh, it might make your ethical reasoning less applicable, right? If you don't kind of know how to fill in the context, and when you do fill in the context of a particular moral dilemma, the abstract rule might not apply so well. Just in a practical sense, you might not want to have time or the thought to refer to like categorical imperative or the greatest happiness principle. And you might just think the idea of like a one size fits all approach to ethical dilemmas is just really, really just too thin, right? To really appreciate the richness of a situation you have. And that it's just a bad idea to try to abstract away from all the particularities of our, being, right? Who we are, and where we live, and what time we live, and all these kinds of things. So that's the third point. The fourth point is that it rejects a conception between public and private spheres, or at least some conception of that, or at least a prioritization of public or of the public sphere. Sorry. What does this mean? Well, think about public relations, right? Relations you have, maybe at work or at school, relationships we consider to be professional, or meeting strangers on the street. There's a certain kind of, what you might say, contractual kind of relationship there, where you're a consenting adult, you view the other person as a consenting adult, and you have a great deal of respect for them. They're able to make whatever choices they want to make, and you make whatever choices you want to make, and that's the way you can treat that person. Now, private relationships are not always like that, right? They're not as stilted, they're not as distanced, right? Your independence is not held so far apart. A great example of this is children, right? They don't have that kind of independence. They're very dependent upon adults or caretakers for all kinds of things, financially, emotionally, cognitively, all kinds of things. And to treat the relationship between a child and a parent in the same way as two adults on the street might seem just like a terrible idea. And also it might not seem, the public relationship might not seem like the best starting point, right? A good way to understand what the right thing to do is as like a parent, say. And also just maybe in like a romantic relationship, you don't want to be so stilted. You care for the person, right? You'll be more concerned about what they're doing. You want to kind of aid them in their decision making and these kinds of things. And the fifth component here is that they view agents as fundamentally interpersonal. Now, this should be we're kind of leading up to this, where the idea is that moral agents, people who use moral reasoning, are kind of, for ethics of care, fundamentally intertwined and interdependent upon others, right? That you're not an isolated, autonomous, independent, highly independent individual for your entire life, right? And that really your orientation in the world is fundamentally shaped by the fact that you are a son or a daughter, that you have a certain gender, that you are of a certain race, that you live in a certain time, a certain community, you had a certain kind of upbringing, and all these kinds of things kind of like, really shape your overall kind of like psyche and everything until, you become an adult. And at that point, people achieve a certain sense of independence, and it's definitely a component to people's lives, right? When you're a fully competent, independent adult, and you're really in charge of everything that you're doing, and you see your decisions for what they are, but that's, a part of your life, right? It's not the default kind of stance of moral reasoning. That's the idea for ethics of care, that there are these other kind of relationships of dependency that really should take priority. So those are all some features. And lastly, let me say, why do we study ethics of care? Well, one thing is to kind of juxtapose it against theories like Kant and Mill, so we can better see the commitments they have. But also when it comes to computing technology and ethical dilemmas in computing technology, one thing that arises is this kind of particularist orientation, right? So for example, if let's say like 10 years ago, you were mistaken for, I don't know, a serial killer or something like this, right? And the police figured out really quickly that you weren't the person, you just happened to have like a similar last name, and I don't know, like drove a similar car or something. But like every time someone Googles your name, that's the first thing that comes up, so-and-so's serial killer, right? And you're like, I need to get rid of this. I can't get a job and all this kind of stuff. Well, what you do is you go to Google and you submit, an appeal to kind of like ask them to change their algorithm to correct that. And the way in which Google, handles those kinds of things is not by giving a hard and fast rule, but by taking each case by case, right? Now, you might think Google's wrong for doing that, and you might think Google's very bad at doing it. There's good reason to think that they, give all kinds of different people priorities for whatever reason, and that they might be somewhat arbitrary on what cases they take and how they handle them. But that overall approach, that kind of piecemeal approach, is a particular kind of way to deal with ethical ethical dilemmas. And so you might think that when it comes to issues of privacy or free speech on the internet or something like that, some are always looking for what's the kind of like general rule of censorship or something like this, or what should be like the overall law. What are you entitled to in terms of your privacy? And you might think that that's the wrong question to ask, right? The better question to ask is, how is this going to, how are you going to like take care of users if you're doing this from the standpoint of a company, or you're a startup or something like this, or you might think that there shouldn't be a general hard and fast rule. We need to take these kind of situations case by case and step by step, and we need to kind of get into the nuances of who are the users and what do they really want and how can we fulfill their needs and stuff like this. Now, this is not exactly the ethics of care as a broad ethical paradigm, but it does provide an alternative orientation towards ethical dilemmas, right? So anyways, that's it for today. I will be talking with you all shortly. Thanks.